Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. We are thrilled to have you with us this evening. Happy spring, even though it might be a little premature here on MDI. We are channeling positive thoughts and going to pretend that it is spring, but it is certainly on its way. I think we can see evidence of that. So this evening we have a special treat for all of you. We have an art and science cafe, and I think many of you know that Dr. Haller, who is also the president of the MDI Biological Laboratory, a physician scientist, is also an art historian. And while he is a very competent scientist and physician, I think his true passion is art and certainly the marriage of art and science. And so we are very excited to have him with us this evening as we explore the Jacques-Louis David painting or portrait of Antoine and Marie-Anne Lavoisier. And if you have not had a chance to see this portrait in person, it is hanging in the Met. And it is not something that you would casually find in most living rooms. I think the size is somewhere in the neighborhood of 8.5 feet by 6.5 feet. So it is a very large format portrait, but beautifully done. And I think the story behind the painting to me is just an amazing one. And we have a wonderful storyteller in Dr. Haller to share with us the many intricate details that make up this wonderful story. So, Dr. Haller, welcome. We are thrilled to have you and really looking forward to hearing this wonderful story this evening.
Well, thank you, Terry, for the very kind introduction. I don't know whether art is my true
Okay, well, you have a
or
lot of true
positive side.
passions.
It's very difficult to make a decision. Hello, everybody. So we are going to talk about Antoine and Marie-Anne Lavoisier. Or perhaps I should put it the other way around. You'll see this in a minute. So the two of them, Terry has already mentioned this. We have been at the Met. We had a talk about these two, and we'll add now the history or information about the painter Jacques-Louis David. And I've called it Art and Science in Revolutionary Times because you will immediately see this is and has been a time not only for France, but also for the US. And we'll talk about both revolutions, about the revolution in France, and hopefully I can move this. So we will talk mostly about the French Revolution, but the revolution and the war in the colonies will also come up. So let me start with the painting. So we are standing in front, sorry about that. We're standing in front of this huge painting. It's really one of the most gigantic portraits we have in the 18th century. And you can see the couple. Uh, I mentioned that it's a portrait of her and him because she's obviously the more prominent figure in the painting. We see her in this white mousseline dress with a blue sash. She has powdered hair and she is standing and has her arm on his shoulders. We see him sitting there, and while she is actually looking at us, and she is, as I said, the dominant figure in this portrait, he is looking up to her. And you will see when we discuss the painting that he was very much dependent on her. But I think it also tells you about the close relationship between the two of them. There's a lot of balance in the painting, and you can see on the right hand, obviously, science, and we'll talk about this, the scientific instrument. But you can also see on the left-hand side in the background, there is something like we don't know exactly what it is, but I can tell you this is a portfolio where she has her paintings, her designs, and we'll talk about this in a minute. So this is the couple. The year is 1788-89. Jacques-Louis David was born in 1748, so by the time he was 40 years old. Now, the two of them were married in 1771. So by the time the painting was done, they were 17 years married. And we can already mention that it will only be another 5 years, and then he will end up at the guillotine. So they married in 71, and it's a very interesting story. And we'll first talk about her because her father was a very rich bourgeois. He was director of Firm General. And we'll talk about the Firm General. This was the tax company because the taxes were had been sourced out by the government, by the French king, to individuals. And they formed a group of what they called Firm General. They were bringing in the taxes and could keep money. And her father was the director of that. And then he got a letter from a rich marquis when she was 13 years old. And this marquis, who had not a lot of money left, but was an aristocrat, he wanted to marry the young Marianne. And this was not that uncommon during that time. This was what they called aristocrats, bourgeois gilding their houses. But Marianne said definitely no. So her father was desperate because this marquis was influential at the court. And he actually told her father, well, if this doesn't work out, you will be fired. I'll take care of that. So the father asked Lavoisier, who was also a director at the Firm General, and we'll talk about this in a minute, and they got married. So Lavoisier said, wonderful, I marry her. And this was a very happy marriage. So I've already talked about the background a little bit. Oh, here you see her travel chest. This is her cosmetics, pins, and stationery. And this is not in Paris. This is at Cornell, because Cornell, the university, they have quite a collection from Marianne from the 1830s. So this gives you a little bit insight into her. But now we'll talk about this background portfolio. And now you can see it more clearly. This is where she kept her paintings, because she trained with David. Actually, she was not only a pupil of David and a very talented one, but she was the one who asked David whether he could paint them. And this is not one of many portraits. As I already mentioned, a portrait this size is rather unique, and it was very costly. The Lavoisiers paid 7,000, and she had signed the contract, so she was paying, and this was a very high sum. Even the king for paintings normally paid less than that. So she was a painter. And here you can see some of her sketches, because she was also working with Lavoisier in the lab. Marianne was directing experiments. She was painting experiments. She is sitting here on the right-hand side in these, and these are the experiments. And we'll talk about the Lavoisier lab in a minute. So she was an extraordinary woman. And she also had learned several languages. She was fluent in 3 different languages. She could not only talk English, but she could translate English. And she was actually the one not only running the lab and supporting the experiments, painting, but she was the one running the salon. Every week they had guests where the academy, friends of the family came, and one of them was Benjamin Franklin. You know that Franklin spent years in Paris in the 1770s when he was negotiating with the French government. And since he was also a scientist, Lavoisier thought electricity is not that interesting because he was more interested in chemistry. But Franklin was there quite often. And so was Jefferson and other visitors from the UK as well. And Marianne was the one translating, doing the honneurs, and running the salons. Last not least, she was editing and illustrating the textbooks of Lavoisier. Lavoisier is a very famous chemist. We'll talk about this in a minute, but here you see engravings in Le Traité élémentaire de chimie. This is the first classical textbook ever in chemistry. And as you can already see, it's very important to have these instruments. So here you see a clear link to how we work in the lab because we are dependent on our instruments as well. And she was the one uh, making the figures for these textbooks, and this was published in 1789. So altogether, you can see why she is so important in this painting and that they form a couple, a scientific couple together. Now, what about him? Antoine Laurent Lavoisier was born into a bourgeois family. He inherited quite a bit of money from his grandmother, and then he bought himself a chair in these fermes générales. This is how he made his living. He was not only a great scientist, but first he was organizing his life to be able to be a scientist by earning a lot of money. He traveled a lot in France. He was interested in geology first, and then he became more and more interested in fluids and in gases. And you can see in this painting there he's writing what every scientist should do. So we tell our scientists, publish, publish, publish. This is what he's doing with her help. And then David told him most likely, so which instruments do you find we should paint and have in the painting, which are most important for you? So Lavoisier is famous in France. So every school child learns about his books. He's called the father of chemistry, and you can imagine that there are blocks out that Marianne is the mother of chemistry. So both together, they are the couple. And here you see Lavoisier's name on the Eiffel Tower in France. So what did he do? What is his research about? And these are his most famous books. They published at that time in the academy papers like we do, but then they also collected this together. And here you see the Opuscule Physique et Chimique that was published in 1774. And this is a description, a collection of the experiments he had been doing both with fluid and with gases. And then in the middle, you see the traité, this most important textbook of chemistry, where you have already seen the figures made by his wife. And on the right-hand side, you see a very famous book. This was published after he had died on the guillotine. And this is the first nomenclature of chemistry. So this was the time when everything was measured. This was the time when everything got cataloged. And this is where all our systems in chemistry, what you have seen in high school, you remember all the different elements, the table of the elements. This is what Lavoisier developed in the early 1790s. And you can see on the painting the instruments. So this glass balloon you can see here is not only a wonderful example of how well David could paint. You see the reflections of the windows of his study, but it also shows you how wonderful these instruments are. You need this instrument, for instance, to measure the weight of gases. So you have to clean it very thoroughly. You fill it with water, you wash it out, then you clean it again, you try it, and then you measure it with room air. And then you take the room air out and you fill it with the air from the experiment. And we'll talk about this in a minute, what you want to measure. And then you measure it again. So you're measuring the weight of gases. And this is the beginning of modern chemistry. He was able to do all this, and his most famous experiments are on oxygen. So Lavoisier was the one who named oxygen and characterized it first. And he is in a famous line of chemists at that time. So Joseph Priestley, he was from the UK, came to the US, and Henry Cavendish was in the UK. And they could show that water consists of hydrogen and oxygen. So this was modern chemistry. Water, which we all consider to be one element, that it's actually made out of two. This was the scientific sensation and a breakthrough. And if there would have been a Nobel Prize, it would have been given to the three of them. But Lavoisier went one step further. He not only could show that, yes, water consists of hydrogen and oxygen, but he did it both ways. He synthesized it and he analyzed it. So his experimental approach was well thought of, was in a way better. And what I already mentioned, he was the first one to measure that really when you break down water into oxygen and hydrogen, that the sum of the gases is the same as of the water it comes from. So this is a sentence every school child in France has to know. Rien ne se perd, rien ne se crée, tout se transforme. Which actually means, and this is on the basis of what we do in the lab, that nothing is lost. It just transforms, and it's either energy or substance, but it's a continuous change. In order to do that, you have to be able to measure. And I don't think any of you, including me, have ever been to the Laboratoire de Lavoisier, which is in the museum in Paris. So after he had died, his wife kept his instruments in the family, and they are now in the museum. And we can go there and have a look at them, and they are delicate. They are of very high quality. So he was using a gasometer. You can see this here. I already talked about measuring and weighing gases. So these instruments had to be very delicate, and you can appreciate the high quality and the technical acumen you need in order to generate them. He collaborated with famous and expensive engineers at the time. So people like Nicolas Fortin or Etienne Lenoir, they are famous engineers, and you can see how delicate these instruments were. And here you see the link between money and research. In order to do good research, you need money. And this is what Lavoisier had. So you can also see that being a scientist was not somebody who's poor, but being a scientist was aristocracy, which caused a problem when you have the revolution of the people. Here you see what they did in the lab. These are experiments. So this is not alchemy. This is really a setup where everything is written down. It's still very interesting to see his lab books, which he kept and published. And here you can see Marianne sitting on the right-hand side, and she was adding, not only sketching these experiments, but taking notes. So she was a real partner in that. You can also see that they did physiological experiments. So it was not only chemistry, They wanted to know what oxygen actually does. And he found out that combustion keeps and transforms substance into energy, but he also found out that this is the same in human beings. So here we transform substance into energy for our body temperature, and he carried out these experiments demonstrating this. And this is another setup which Marianne made a sketch from and taking notes of the experiment. This is a nicely organized lab. It looks almost like MDI-BL, but it is in Paris. And I already mentioned this. This is the traité élémentaire de chimie. And here you see how wonderfully she made all these the designs of the instruments he was using, and also how these experiments were set up in the book. This is now at the Wellcome Trust in London. But Lavoisier was not only, and I've mentioned this before, the father of chemistry, he was also a tax collector. He had a chair at the Ferme Générale. There were only 38 in France at the time, making a lot of money. He was also a pioneering scientific farmer. So chemistry has a lot to do with farming. So he actually used nitrates and he used other substances in order to improve farming. And he had a farm about 70 miles from Paris where he tried out new ways how to grow things. And he was very successful with that as well. And last but not least, he was the commissioner of the Royal Gunpowder and Saltpeter Administration starting in 1775. And gunpowder, that was a very important part of his profession. He was paid well for that as well. But he moved actually into the lab on the premises of the gunpowder factory in the middle of Paris. I have to mention before we go on that as a tax collector, he also had new ideas. And this was not always well received by the public. So he found out, being a scientist, that more than 60% of the goods entering Paris were not taxed because Paris had grown. There were no real entrances where you could control this. So he talked to the government and they started to build new controls in order to raise more taxes. So this was very efficient for the government, which was broke most of the time. But as you can imagine, the name Lavoisier was not only associated with science, only for his colleagues at the Academy, but it was more associated with tax collection and with gunpowder. Now, before we move on with the story of Lavoisier and his wife, let me briefly talk about the painter. The painter is Jacques-Louis David, born 1748, so 3 years before Lavoisier. He died in 1825, so he survived these changes from the Ancien Regime, aristocracy. He was the painter of the Revolution, and he was the painter of the Emperor. So Jacques-Louis David covers really a very interesting era, both in France, in Europe, but also for the US. Here you see him as a young kid. He is 17 years old, and he started, and this is interesting for art history, obviously, as a Rococo painter. So this shows you a portrait, and this is in the best tradition of Rococo. This means aristocracy painting. This is another example. I will stop then. This is François Boucher, very famous Rococo painter, Madame Pompadour, the maitresse of the king. But then he got a stipend to Rome, and then he was influenced not only stylistically, but also content-wise. This is not dancing. This is not elegant aristocracy. This is now serious Roman history. This is Republican history. So you can see the style is classicism. The oath of the Horatia is about we are fighting for the Republic. So you can see it's not only a stylistic change, but he got more involved with these Republican ideas. This is a painting which is just around the corner from our painting we have started with at the Met. This is the death of Socrates. So Socrates died because he was educating young people in a better way, and the government didn't like this. So you can see there is already revolutionary content. And then this got worse over the years. So this is 1789. This is the same year he painted the Lavoisier family. And here the lictors bring to Brutus the bodies of his sons. So this is not only Republican, but here you can see that changing society is associated with death. By the way, he was not alone with that. Lavoisier was sympathetic to these thoughts, as was a lot of the aristocracy. And the king actually bought this painting you're just seeing, but he paid 6,000 livres, while the Lavoisier family paid 7,000 for their portrait. So coming back to the portrait and coming back to the different jobs he had, I mentioned this, we have to talk about the time the painting was painted. So Marianne had asked him in 1788, and there was already a lot of pro-Republican thoughts. And during 1789, then the king, because he was broke, had asked the people come together. He overruled the parliament, and they were discussing more taxes and the financial situation. But this turned immediately in 1789 into an uproar. You can see Jacques-Louis David painted the tennis court oath, where they declared we will not move before we have a constitution. And then a month later, the Bastille was stormed. The Bastille is actually next to where Lavoisier was living. So the gunpowder factory is just around the corner from the Bastille. And imagine during the same time, we have all this going on in Paris. David is finishing the painting and they are planning to have it at an exhibition in August. What we have learned over the last couple of years from the restoration efforts at the Met, that the original painting was very different. So during these revolutionary times, David actually changed the painting. Here you can see one spectroscopy of the painting on the left-hand side and an X-ray on the right-hand side, where you can see underneath the painting we have right now what it looked like before. And it was very different. While we have a more bourgeois couple, a scientific couple in our original painting, this was originally a more aristocratic couple. She is wearing a fancy hat. This was actually called Chapeau de Tartare. This was by famous opera, which was on stage during that time. And he's wearing a different coat, different colors. In the background, you can't see it very clearly. There are books. It's a much richer atmosphere. And we can imagine that during these revolutionary times, David and Lavoisier, because they both shared the same Republican ideas, they toned down the aristocratic meaning of the painting and made it more scientific. So it's not only about the dresses, but it's the overall. Here you can see it. It looks very calm. It doesn't look very rich at all. It looks much more scientific than the first version. It never made it to the exhibition. The exhibition took place. It was the Salon of August 1789, but they still thought that Lavoisier was a person who was not that well liked by the public, and they were afraid that there would be an uproar and people would have negative feelings about the Lavoisier's display. It was never on display for the next 100 years, but it stayed in the family. So I've already mentioned this. This is the Estate Generale when they met. The king is presiding. And then our painter was immediately involved with all that. This is the tennis court oath. You have Robespierre, Mirabeau, you have Bali and Marat up there. So these are the leading people of the revolution, and David was one of them. And then they formed the tribunal. This is a year later when all the people went first to court, but then almost immediately to the guillotine. And David was involved in that. He actually made costumes for Revolutionary Guards. He was the painter of the revolution. And as I said before, Lavoisier was not that against all that, but he thought he could walk the middle line. And this very famous painting by Marat, this is the death of Marat, by David, the death of Marat, which is now in Brussels. As I said, Lavoisier was a tax collector. Tax collectors were hated. So initially, he supported all these changes. He actually had never used his title. He was de Lavoisier, but he gave it up immediately. Ironically, they didn't let him be third état. So he wanted to be bourgeois. And they said, no, 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 you're too rich for that. And then he wanted to join the aristocracy, and the aristocracy said, no, 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 you are not part of us either. So this tells you a little bit about the situation of Lavoisier during the revolution. And now I'll tell you the story how Lavoisier was directly linked to the US and US history. So I've mentioned that he worked in the gunpowder factory. You can see here on the left-hand side, the Bastille still existent, and then next to it is the gunpowder factory. You can still go there. This is in the Marais. This is next to the Seine River when you're in Paris, and you can see on the right-hand side, this is the house Lavoisier lived in. He reorganized and made gunpowder production very efficient in France. So he optimized the formula of gunpowder, being a chemist, 75% saltpeter, 25% charcoal, and 12.5% sulfur. It was not without danger. So they had an experiment, for instance, his friend and colleague Berthollet had proposed, well, perhaps you should use instead of saltpeter another nitrate, and they had this big explosion and 3 people died. Saltpeter business was serious. You know that potassium nitrate is made from animals and animal excretions, and then you can see this here on house walls. So this was important to collect that and then to make efficient gunpowder. And as I said, over 5 years, over 10 years, Lavoisier turned this around and made this business of making gunpowder, and they were making 5 million pounds per year for the different wars, into a success story. And who needed gunpowder seriously were the Americans. So George Washington, this shows you Bunker Hill. They had only 13 shots when they started Bunker Hill, and they ran out of gunpowder within a relatively short time. And Bunker Hill was lost because of lack of gunpowder. You can imagine that the British had taken care that all the gunpowder had left the colonies. So there is a famous raid of the colonists in the Bermudas to get British gunpowder, but the effort was really to convince the French to provide them with gunpowder. This is a long story. I will not go into all details. They sent Benjamin Franklin. They sent Silas Deane from Connecticut. The Comte de Vergennes, he was the minister of the exterior, and they cooked up how to best transport the gunpowder to the colonies. Now, France was not at war with the British, so they had to build a secret company. And Pierre Beaumarchais, ironically, the composer of the opera of the Hat you have seen a couple of minutes ago, he was the director of this company. So he was not only a composer, he was also a spy and he was working for the government. So the five of them, the Comte de Vergennes, Silas Deane, Pierre Beaumarchais, Lavoisier, and Benjamin Franklin, they organized. And from 1775 to 76, they sent 1 million pounds of gunpowder. And the next year, another million pounds of gunpowder. And the first battle won with French gunpowder was the battle at Saratoga, where the revolutionaries first won and the British lost. So the success of the American Revolution was made by this sinister group. Lavoisier, the scientist, I mean, he didn't play a big part in that, but it was based on his science. Didn't help him. In 1793, when times were very tense in Paris, you can see this on the left-hand side. This is Gouache by Jean-Baptiste Lesueur. He was put into prison. He negotiated. It was a very difficult time. I could tell you for half an hour how he tried to escape first, and then his wife convinced him to turn himself in because her dad, who was also a tax collector, had already been imprisoned. So he gave himself up. At that time, the wonderful ideas of liberty had changed a lot. So on the left-hand side, you see the Tree of Liberty with a revolutionary cap, and on the right-hand side, you see what James Gilray in London thought about what's happening. Sorry about that. They had executed Louis XVI in 1794. Here you see a sketch from David, our most famous painter, of Marie Antoinette on her way to the guillotine. But even David was imprisoned. And then on May 8th, 1794, unfortunately, 6 months before this whole terror was over, Lavoisier, together with all the other tax collectors, went to the guillotine together. And a famous mathematician, Joseph Louis de Lagrange, said it took them only a moment to sever that head, and 100 years perhaps will not suffice to produce another like it. David, at that time, was in prison. He was in prison in the Jardin de Luxembourg, and this is a painting. Both paintings are in the Louvre. This is a self-portrait of him when he was in prison, still believing in the revolution, and this is a view into the garden. He was in prison together with another famous revolutionary from the US, with Thomas Paine. They were actually living door to door during that time, and they both escaped the guillotine because 6 months later, Robespierre went to the guillotine, and these terrible times were over. And then came the famous hero of the revolution. So it was not like the restoration of old times, it was the new times with Jacques-Louis David painting Napoleon in 1798. And then he became the painter of the emperor. This is Napoleon crossing the Alps. This is Napoleon, the imperial coronation in Notre Dame. And David, you may not be able to see this. He is not painting how Napoleon grounds himself, but Napoleon is crowning Josephine, his wife. And this is the last painting of Napoleon by Jacques-Louis David. This is in his study at the Tuileries in 1812. 1814, everything was over. This was, as I said, the last painting. And then when Napoleon had lost, after he had conquered the whole of Europe, David couldn't stand because he was totally convinced, and his whole generation was convinced of the revolution, Republican ideas, and they even thought that Napoleon was Republican. He went into exile and he died 8 years later in exile in Brussels. And with him, a lot of these revolutionaries from the 1790s went. And this is one of the last, or the last portrait of him in 1824. A very interesting story is the portrait you see is at the Louvre because France loves David. The portrait of the revolutionary Marat, which is also a famous portrait in all the books in France, is in Brussels. And not because the Belgian didn't want the painting to go to France. They have asked the government several times. And the French government was always reluctant. The famous revolutionary perhaps should better stay in Brussels. So what happened to all the others? You've heard that Lavoisier went to the guillotine. His wife, heartbroken, she had to give up all her wealth for a year and a half, and then it was reconstituted. She got the house. She got all his experimental equipment. She got the money back, and she lived for the next 40 years in Paris. She remarried. She married an American. You can see Benjamin Thompson on the right-hand side. He actually came to Paris not directly from the US, but from Bavaria. He's the one who was working as an engineer and a scientist for the Bavarian king after 1814. And he built, for instance, the English Garden in Munich. And then he became aristocracy and he could give himself a title and he called himself Count of Rumford. And Rumford is in New Hampshire, which is now Concord. So she married him. It was an unhappy marriage. She was always convinced that she was still Madame Lavoisier. She didn't like him. He didn't like her. They were fighting, and within 3 years, they were divorced. When you're in Paris, you not only can see where the Lavoisiers have lived, you can go to her grave at the Père Lachaise. It's not that far from where Jim Morrison is buried. And then last or least, Lavoisier had not only because of the gunpowder in the 1776, 77, he had an impact on the industry in the US because of Dupont. Eleuthère Irénée Dupont, you can see him on the right-hand side. He was a student of Lavoisier. Lavoisier was friends with his father, who actually had an affair after Lavoisier went to the guillotine with his wife, but that's another story. But Eleuthère was a student of Lavoisier and learned how to make gunpowder. Lavoisier lent them a lot of money, and they were still broke. And in 1804, the whole family emigrated to the US, to Virginia. And there, Eleuthère found that the gunpowder was not of high quality. And he remembered his time in the Lavoisier lab, and he started the first powder mill on the Brandywine River near Wilmington. It's still there. You can still see the ruins of the mill. There is a famous museum there telling the whole story about gunpowder right from the start, 1775, 76, arriving in the US. And it's obviously paid for and has been founded by the DuPont family. And this was the start of the chemical empire. So this is the story of Antoine Laurent and Marianne Paul's Lavoisier. I think it's very interesting. It combines in one painting uh, the history of science with the history of art. And I think it tells you up to these days a lot about instrumentation, about experiments, about politics and science. So it's a wonderful painting. And last not least, Jerry and I, we met this painting again. We were sitting at the NIH in the corridor going to the office of the NIH director. And here they have all the portraits of the former NIH president. And this is the portrait of Harold Warmus. He was NIH director from 1993 to 1999. He got the Nobel Prize in the 80s. He is a cancer researcher. He first found that we have our oncogenes in us and then mutate, and then they can turn cells into cancer cells. And this is what he got the Nobel Prize for. And he loved this painting. Before he became NIH director, he was a director at the Rockefeller. And at the Rockefeller, they actually had this painting. So the interesting story is, how did the Rockefeller get this painting from the Lavoisier family? It's a very interesting story. In the 1920s, one of the professors of the Rockefellers had dinner at the Lavoisier family, and he saw the painting. And they were not well off. So he asked them whether they would be interested in selling the painting, and they said yes. So he called Rockefeller, who was in Marseille on holidays, and Rockefeller came to Paris, saw the painting, and bought it immediately for the Rockefeller Institute. And it was hanging there. And it had one obligation, as it was fundraising. It was said, if you ever sell this painting, make sure that the profits go to science. So when the Metropolitan bought the painting, actually it was gifted to them in the 90s, they paid for it. And up to these days, the income from this painting is still paying for 2 professorships at the Rockefeller University. So this is a long story. We started early in 1770s, and now we are both, Jerry, you remember sitting in the corridor. It was very quiet. It's at a time when NIH has lots of difficulties. I hope that can turn things around, and I think looking back in history provides us with hope of change. Thank you very much for your attention.
That was wonderful, Dr. Haller. Thank you so much. I mean, so much to unpack in just one painting. You did a beautiful job of taking us on a long journey. So thank you so much. If anyone has questions for Dr. Haller, we'd be happy to maybe stop the share and we can just have a conversation about some of what we heard this evening. So feel free to either just raise your hand or take yourself off mute if you would like, and we can chat. So not sure if is that your screen, Dr. Haller, or maybe Kelsey's screen.
I, I don't think it's my screen.
Okay, there we go.
I've stopped sharing, so I'm off.
All right, wonderful. So anyone have any questions for Dr. Haller? Yes. Go ahead, David.
Do you know anything? Apparently, Lavoisier was a member, along with Benjamin Franklin, was a member of the commission that investigated Dr. Mesmer. And do you know anything about that story? And did Anne-Marie have any involvement in that?
I don't know about Anne-Marie, but I know the story of this commission. So you know that Dr. Mesmer was very successful with his new therapeutic approaches. It's like today you have a new invention and you use it to cure patients, and everybody is really mesmerized by that. So he used electricity, and but then the academy said we have to look into that more carefully, and they put together a commission. And as you mentioned, Lavoisier was on that commission. Benjamin Franklin was on the commission. He actually wanted to become academy member there. And interestingly enough, there was also a doctor on that, and this was Dr. Guillotin. He was a doctor who invented the guillotine.
Yes.
And he thought that this was a very humane approach how to kill people effectively. So he was well liked. And there was a fourth, and I don't recall number four. And they came to the conclusion that there is no scientific evidence to explain this. And also very modern, in their report, they wrote that most likely it's just fulfilling the expectations of the patient.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I think that Marat had some ill feelings about this because I think Marat was a fan of Mesmer's, and I think that was part of the enmity between Marat and Lavoisier later on.
Yeah. I mean, the Marat story is, I mean, Marat was also a medical doctor, a scientist, but he didn't publish a lot, and his publications were not successful, and he never became an academy member. So you can imagine that he hated academics and he hated the academy.
Yes.
So he was really not supportive. He wrote, he had this famous Ami de Peuple newspaper where he wrote every day. And he said, Lavoisier, give me a break. You know, today he says this, tomorrow he says something else. I mean, what type of scientist is that? So he had his hands in the downfall of Lavoisier. He was definitely agitating against him.
Yes. Thank
That's
you.
cool. Yes, go ahead. You have your hand raised.
Who or what led to Lavoisier bringing all this chemistry together in its form? I mean, clearly there must have been some folks that were putting out this view of things that he could then gather in and codify into his trait.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good question. So first of all, we are at the end of the 18th century. People are classifying everything. I mean, this is when plants were classified. You know, the whole system we have by Linnaeus about classifying plants. So this was about classifying elements. Was about classifying experimental approaches, making systematic approaches. And this was basically done everywhere. This is the time when the encyclopedia was put together for the first time in France. They were trying, and at the same time, they had a very active communication system. So they published, they sent their papers from London to Paris, from Paris to all over Europe and in the US. This was the time when the Academy in Philadelphia was formed, and they knew about their publications within a couple of months. So they then collected these publications and put them together. It was not a question of plagiarism. You just took what you had. And since Marianne was translating a lot of these papers. So obviously the papers by Priestley were written in English and Lavoisier couldn't read them, but she translated them and then he put them into this Traité de Chimie, which he published them.
That's great. For those that might be interested, Dr. Haller has actually published this, essentially this story in a wonderful format. It's available on our website. There's a link to it in the chat there. And while you're on that page, you can learn a bit more about our art and science program. So Dr. Haller mentioned that we do tours of a lot of the museums across the United States. And for members of our Star Point Society, that's a little perk that we make available to folks. So if you're interested, you can find out more on our website, and do take a moment to download the PDF of this Lavoisier story. I think it's a wonderful essay that kind of summarizes what we heard tonight. So thank you all so much for being here. We are looking forward to our next Science Cafe, which will be on May 11th, and that will actually feature three of our scientists actually, but moderated by one. And we're going to talk about a totally different subject, where we talk about this teeny tiny little worm that many scientists utilize in their research, called C. elegans. And we're going to talk about how it's being used at the MDI Biological Laboratory, but really about the history of it overall in terms of promoting scientific research. I think something like 7 Nobel Prizes have been awarded based on science done with this teeny microscopic worm. So if you're interested in that topic, we'd love to have you join us next month. And in the meantime, make sure you've signed up for any notices of future science cafes. So thank you all so much. And Dr. Haller, thank you again for sharing just a wonderful story with us and helping us appreciate the many facets of art and science. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.